I want to talk about Vladimir Putin. I want to describe to this chamber a bipartisan victory that together we won. And then I want to describe tragically how President Joe Biden is giving that victory away to Putin and Russia. To understand this issue, we need to go back to the summer of 2019. In the summer of 2019, Russia was in the process of constructing a pipeline called the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Behind me is a map demonstrating where the Nord Stream 2 pipeline runs. It is a pipeline that was to run from Russia to Germany, going underneath the Baltic Sea. In the summer of 2019, the pipeline was nearly complete. At various periods in time, it was 70% complete, 80% complete. There was widespread consensus that if this pipeline were completed, it would have devastating consequences. In a few minutes, I will discuss those consequences in greater detail. But in an effort to stop the devastating consequences, I worked on bipartisan legislation along with Senator Jeanne Shaheen, Democrat from New Hampshire, and we introduced bipartisan sanctions legislation designed to stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That legislation, when we introduced it, was almost immediately subject to a Russian disinformation campaign. In Europe, the Russians were saying to anyone who would listen that the Cruz-Shaheen sanction legislation could never pass, that there was no way Congress would come together in a bipartisan manner to stop the Nord Stream 2, that it was hopeless, that no one needed to be concerned that this legislation could pass. They also made the argument as part of their disinformation campaign that the pipeline was nearly complete, so that U.S. sanctions could not stop it. There was nothing that could be done to stop it. Well, Mr. President, to the surprise of nobody who follows these issues, that Russian disinformation was precisely that. It was disinformation. It was lies. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Shaheen and I worked with our colleagues, and our legislation was initially voted out of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee by an overwhelming bipartisan vote of 20 to 2. Overwhelming bipartisan support. At that point, Senator Shaheen and I began working to get it passed on the floor of the Senate. While we were doing so, the Russian disinformation continued. This cannot pass. We endeavored to have our sanctions legislation attached to the National Defense Authorization Act, which was moving in the fall and winter of 2019. To do so, Mr. President, was not easy. To do so, we needed to get the explicit sign-off of the chairman and the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We needed the explicit sign-off of the chairman and the ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. We needed the explicit sign-off of the chairman and ranking member of the Senate Banking Committee. And then we needed the explicit sign-off of Senator McConnell and Senator Schumer, the Republican and Democratic leader, respectively. All 8 of those individuals, all 8 of those senators needed to agree with our legislation for this to proceed on the NDAA. And then, Mr. President, we had to do the exact same thing in the House of Representatives and get the chairman and ranking member on foreign relations, on armed services, on banking, and we had to get the sign-off of Nancy Pelosi and Kevin McCarthy. To get the explicit support of all 16 of those congressional leaders, 8 Republicans and 8 Democrats, in any world is not easy. And I will say, on my part and Senator Shaheen's part, we invested dozens, if not hundreds of hours in terms of talking to our colleagues to build that bipartisan consensus. And we ended up getting that overwhelming support. In many ways, that support was miraculous. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons why Nord Stream 2 is particularly problematic is that Russia is building Nord Stream 2 in order to cut off Ukraine. There is currently a pipeline running through Ukraine, and through Nord Stream 2, Russia has the power to starve Ukraine. Why is it miraculous in December of 2019 that we're able to pass this legislation? Well, if you recall what was happening in the House of Representatives in December of 2019, the House of Representatives was in the middle of impeaching President Donald Trump for alleged high crimes and misdemeanors concerning Ukraine. If you recall, Mr. President, from the trial we held on this Senate floor, central to the allegations that were raised by Democrats against President Trump was conduct concerning Ukraine. It remains astonishing that right in the middle of a partisan gladiatorial battle concerning Ukraine, simultaneously we were able to get Republicans and Democrats to work hand in hand to agree with complete consensus that we were going to come together and stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We were going to stop what Vladimir Putin was doing. In December of 2019, our legislation passed. The Cruz-Shaheen sanctions legislation passed. Now, Mr. President, I will remind you of what the Russian disinformation had been when we first introduced it. They said it'll never pass, and they said even if it does pass, it's too late for it to have any effect. Well, if my memory serves me correctly, President Trump signed the Cruz-Shaheen sanctions legislation at 7 p.m. on a Thursday. At 6:45 p.m. on a Thursday, 15 minutes before our sanctions legislation was signed into law, the company that was laying the pipeline in the Baltic Sea announced it had immediately halted laying the pipeline, and it was lifting anchor and sailing away. It was an incredible bipartisan victory. The pipeline was stopped in its tracks. What happened next was absolutely nothing. For a year, the pipeline lay dormant. The talking point from Vladimir Putin, and now sadly adopted by Joe Biden and his administration, is the pipeline is 90% complete, or the pipeline is 95% complete. But, Mr. President, it is not rocket science that a 90% complete pipeline is 0% complete. Until you complete both ends of the pipeline, it ain't nothing but a hunk of metal at the bottom of the ocean. Nothing is traveling through it until the pipeline is complete and online. For a year, the pipeline lay dormant. Then in the year 2020, Senator Shaheen and I joined together again in a second round of bipartisan legislation. A second round of sanctions. We had stopped the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in its tracks. For a year, Putin was stopped altogether, and we came together for a second piece of legislation, the second version of Cruz-Shaheen, and just like the first sanctions, we passed it through both houses of Congress and it was signed into law. With overwhelming bipartisan support, nearly unanimous support of all 535 members of Congress. So we now had two major pieces of sanctions legislation on the books. And those sanctions had been working for a year. The pipeline was stopped. Then in November of 2020 was the presidential election. And in the wake of the presidential election, Joe Biden and his transition team almost immediately began telegraphing weakness to Russia. Members of Joe Biden's foreign policy advisory team in the German newspapers expressed openness to Nord Stream 2 being built, expressed a willingness to try to circumvent the sanctions that had been working and had worked for over a year. Within days of Joe Biden and his team expressing weakness to Putin, Russia and Putin heard, and they began the process of getting ready to return to building the pipeline. Russia did return to building the pipeline. Do you know what day, Madam President? January 24th, 2021. 4 days after Joe Biden was sworn into office, Putin said, "We're safe, we're free, our man Joe is in the White House."